The plan was simple. It was the evening of January 11th, 1921, the east side of Portland, close to where 122nd and Stark Street is today. Back then, it was Baseline Road at an unnamed crossing street. The criminal would be hiding in the shadows. He would be expecting a package of $25,000 to be delivered to him. One vehicle, traveling at only 10 miles an hour, would approach, holding up a burning newspaper so as to be distinguishable as the delivery men. But what the criminal didn't know is that the police were prepared. They had 2 other vehicles following this delivery car. The moment the package was tossed, officers would storm from every direction. He wouldn't have a chance. Arriving at the scene, the police tossed a package filled with blank paper from the vehicle and immediately stopped and swarmed. But somehow, the package was already gone. The criminal was long gone, and the police were left there in silence and bewilderment. It wouldn't be the first time in this case that law enforcement made fools of themselves, embarrassing their department and the city government along with it. The criminal was right there, and they couldn't get him. And they never would. To them, he was just another criminal. But to everyone else, he was the Shadow. So how did this begin? How did the Portland police find themselves trying to pull a sting out on the end of town? It began days earlier. In all, 7 Portland citizens of varying levels of prominence found themselves receiving letters from someone who only identified themselves as Shadow. In each of these letters, which were penned in different handwriting each time, these people were threatened with death if they did not pay him a certain amount of money. The amount demanded depended on who a given letter was sent to. While different newspapers gave different names as to the 7 who were threatened, I believe the following individuals were the actual 7. The first was John Wesley Ladd, a banker in the city, but more importantly, he was the son of one of Portland's most prominent early citizens, William S. Ladd, also a banker. At the time, he received his letter at his home on Market and Park, which would later be replaced by the Parkway Manor, seen here, which itself is now slated for demolition. The letter demanded $25,000 from him. Bernard Benjamin Selling, a retail merchant who ran a successful clothing store, was targeted for $15,000. Henry Jennings and Louis Jeverts, both retail merchants who ran furniture stores, were targeted for $10,000. The other 3 were May Jeverts, wife of Philip Jeverts, the founder of Portland's Multnomah Hotel, William Lippman, son of Lippman, Wolf & Company furniture store co-founder Solomon Lippman. William was working as a dry goods merchant at this time. And finally, there was John Merritt Jones, a postmaster in the city. Because of the prominence of these individuals, the threats made against them made headlines all over town. These letters, signed courtesy of the Shadow, not only threaten the lives of these individuals, but also let them know that any efforts to stop him would be futile. In the letter to William Lippman, published in the Oregon Daily Journal, the shadow wrote, "No matter what protection you may surround yourself with, you will not be safe. There are new ways of administering death, new discoveries of science during the late war have provided means of extermination against which there is no guard." The shadow never clarified what they meant by this or how they intended to circumvent any protection these people had. Did they have access to some kind of special poison or gas? Probably they were just trying to keep these people afraid out of fear of the unknown. He was vague enough in his threats that the victims wouldn't know this exact method he intended to use or if it even existed. With the First World War having recently concluded, a war known for its advancements in battle methods compared to previous wars, the Shadow was likely using this general knowledge to promote some bizarre ability to cause death. He also likely knew these types of people would have no problem surrounding themselves with security, enough to make them feel safe and dismiss these letters, killing the Shadow's motive in its tracks, unless he presented a method that could work around that. The police felt they were just dealing with another prankster, some hothead looking for some easy cash by scaring a few successful businessmen. But it's possible they should have taken this unknown individual a little more seriously. He was not just some fool sniping at subjects from far away. Henry Jennings got a particular scare. When he chose to ignore the Shadow's threatening letters, he received another, crudely written on his own stationery, stating, "I have been here, the Shadow." The Shadow had managed to access Jennings' store and write a note to him from his own office. The solution was simple. Make this Shadow character think that one of these people had agreed to pay them, but instead of them showing up with a bundle of cash, it would be the police sneaking in. And so happened the events of January 11th, 1921. John Wesley Ladd, quote, agreed to pay, and a location was established to meet up with the Shadow, roughly 2 miles east of what would be 82nd and Stark today, making it roughly a short distance east of 122nd and Stark. So the description of the location of this handoff is that it was approximately 2 miles east of 82nd and what was called Baseline at the time, but is Stark Street today, which is what I'm walking along. That would put the location at roughly 124th and Baseline, or Stark, which is pretty much right here, this area right in front of me. Not much going on here. This lot's pretty much blocked off, and it's interesting because one of the reasons that the Shadow likely chose this area is it was described as being forested, and there was like an orchard nearby, which if a place is nice and dark and forested, you can, potentially escape a situation and disappear into the night. And even today, there's no forest here, but it's kind of open. And even like right across the way here, there's like nothing over there. So even to this day, it's a fairly open space. But this is where the Shadow had his first encounter and victory, I guess you could say, over the police force. As Ladd approached, the Shadow would signal him with a light from just off Stark Street. Ladd would respond by waving a burning newspaper from his vehicle on the approach. And you know the rest of the story. The police threw the fake bundle of cash and pounced, but somehow came away empty-handed. They found a spot in the trees where the shadow had crouched down. Next to it, a thermos and lunchbox were left behind. Officers snatched it up, hoping that the shadow left some prints on it somewhere. More on that later. Two reasons provided as to why the shadow had been allowed to escape did not exactly help law enforcement's position. One was the fact that there were 2 cars transporting officers behind Ladd, one of which lingered a ways behind so as not to look suspicious. But they ended up falling too far behind and had to speed up, during which time they lost control and crashed into some brush. The second reason, or justification, was that the police thought the shadow's light signal was coming from the north side of Stark Street, when it was really coming from the south side. Because of this, they initially rushed the woods on the wrong side of the street, giving the shadow the chance to escape. However, this claim is hard to believe, as they noted the bundle they threw was also gone. Thus, the shadow took it. But wouldn't they have also thrown the bundle to the wrong side of the road? How'd the shadow get to it? Officers searched the woods there for hours, embarrassed by their failure to apprehend one individual. Tense and desperate, when a man walking the road nearby was spotted, detectives swarmed, guns drawn, only for the man to identify himself as Patrolman L. Reno. When these men rushed him, not knowing who he was, Reno pulled his gun too, and a shootout nearly ensued. Some local newspapers postulated that Patrolman Reno may have actually been the shadow, with a ready-made cover. Whether this theory was true or not remained to be seen, as the police were, oddly enough, given a second chance to snatch the shadow. The day after their botched effort, the shadow sent a follow-up letter to John Ladd, clearly angered by his deception and cooperation with the police. He now demanded $50,000 under a new threat of annihilation. Again, officers traveled out to the east side of town, near the Mount Hood Electric Railway line. When they arrived, all was quiet, perhaps too quiet. Walking along East Burnside, a rare moment where there's no traffic, trying to get to approximately 90th and Burnside, and somewhere between there, dead ahead, and 90th and Gleason, which would be a little off in this direction, is where this second attempt to apprehend the shadow took place. And right here is where 90th comes in at Burnside, and there's one of these little turn-off streets that I know usually are remainders from when they were going to make more freeways in Portland during the 70s. I don't know if this is directly tied to that, but you have these little side roads here that run right next to another one. And based on the information that I found, there were references to searches focused in the vicinity of 90th and Burnside and up to 90th and Gleason, which is about 5 blocks north along 90th. There was also mentions that the planned place for this second effort handoff thing was close to a stop along the Mount Hood Railway, which, based on maps, was in close proximity to Burnside, right behind me. So this area is mostly this school here now, and some homes, but obviously about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, there would have been substantially fewer homes. And The description is that the shadow kind of picked an area that was somewhat similar in make to the first spot, so it leads me to believe there was a woodsy area in here at one time, maybe where this school is now, or could have been all around here, because it is interesting that the shadow's first effort was way out on the edge of town. It was about like more than 30 blocks, about almost 35 blocks that way, and the epicenter of Portland is in the opposite direction. So it's interesting that in this second effort he actually was more inland, I guess, if that's the right word. So he was perceivably, actually potentially, putting himself in a more better position to be captured. I mean, even if he tried to run, the locals around here, everybody knew about the shadow at this point, and you'd almost think there'd be a lot of locals standing around waiting to help if the police couldn't apprehend this guy, and somehow he got away again. During this search, 2 deputy sheriffs by the name of Mullenhour and Lamonti were searching together when suddenly a man ambushed them out of nowhere. Armed with a German Luger, he ordered their hands up. Outnumbering the man, the officers went for their guns, and the man opened fire, cracking off 6 shots, none of which hit anything. The officers returned fire, also hitting nothing, and amidst the strafing, this man got away. If he was the shadow, he got away again. The 2 sheriffs described the man they saw as being about 5 feet 8 inches tall and 140 pounds. He was dressed in a dark suit and was in a crouched military-style stance before he opened fire, suggesting he may have had past military experience. He also spoke with a strong German accent while carrying a German weapon. When a man somewhat matching this description was seen in the vicinity of John Ladd's home, he left to an undisclosed location for his own safety. And the others, despite the shadow's warnings, got round-the-clock security around their homes. The day after this second botched capture, a boy encountered a man on the street that he felt may have been the shadow. He described this man as being in his late 20s and wearing beat-up clothing. He carried a package with him, perhaps one of the fake bundles. He then fled off into the brush when he saw a vehicle approaching along the road. This encounter occurred approximately 2 hours after the planned rendezvous with the shadow, meaning the man may have been him, and he may have just been a hothead looking for trouble. Whether or not this man was the shadow, police were certain that the man that opened fire on them was. Portland mayor at the time, the notorious George Baker, was also certain of this. His office had also been thoroughly embarrassed by the now multiple failures to obtain this man. He promised the police whatever they needed, particularly in the realm of firearms, machine guns if necessary. So much focus was put on finding this man that the people of Portland became understandably frustrated, not because this man wasn't being caught, but because they felt the police were now being negligent towards other crimes in the city. Who was this man? And more importantly, where was he? Was he a local? Did he have a home in the city? Or was he a ruffian slumming it out in the woods? Whatever the case, it needed to be figured out. And then, a first arrest. On January 15th, a man named John Colonel was arrested at 2nd and Burnside in the heart of Portland's Skid Row when the proprietor of a rooming house he was staying at saw that he was in possession of a German Luger. Upon apprehension, he appeared very nervous and was perspiring, but he claimed he'd been at work when these botched apprehension efforts took place. He worked at the Crown Paper Company along the Willamette River in West Lynn, south of town, and a check on that verified he had, in fact, been there at those times. And you remember that thermos and lunchbox that was found? It just so happened that a print had been pulled. Tests against Colonel's prints, no surprise, came back negative. But at least the police had a print to test. They were one step closer to finally capturing this creature. Right? It was still back to the drawing board at this point, but not for long. The police began to realize that the shadow may have not been some new entity that popped up out of nowhere, but rather, he may have been someone they'd known of before, just under a different name. December 13th, 1920. Weeks before the shadow announced his presence in the City of Roses, a well-to-do local attorney, Roscoe Nelson, and his wife were enjoying a quiet evening at his home on Aspen Street in Willamette Heights. Unbeknown to him, a burglar had snuck in through an unlocked back door. This man held up Nelson and proceeded to ransack his home. But what was interesting about this burglar was that he was very talkative, having passive, polite conversation with the lawyer as he robbed him. The only thing of prominence this crook came away with was a diamond, and then he simply fled into the night. To Nelson's surprise, 2 days after the robbery, they found a package on their doorstep containing some of the, quote, lesser items that the burglar had taken. And after that, Roscoe received a letter from the thief stating that if he gave him $100, he would return that diamond. Roscoe agreed to travel into town and leave the money at a spot on 12th Avenue between Alder and Washington Streets. He dropped off the money, but the ring was never returned. The burglar sent further correspondence saying they never received the money. The two eventually agreed to another exchange, as long as Roscoe agreed to bring him an additional $35. They were to meet at 3rd and Clay in downtown, next to the Municipal Auditorium. But Nelson was surprised when he saw another man come and meet up with him, a man who he said was a courier for the burglar. He took the money for the diamond, and that was that. This unknown thief became known as the talkative burglar, and he would rob several more homes during that December. His next robbery was the home of A.P. Henningsen on December 20th. He followed this with 3 more abrupt robberies of the homes of C.O. Pick on Southwest Yamhill, H.S. Tuthill, not that far away along Salmon, and finally, C.M. Christensen. This last victim, Christensen, lived on Floral Avenue in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, only 3 blocks away from the home of Louis Jeverts, one of the Shadow's victims. Christensen was also, as far as we know, the last victim of the talkative burglar. The robberies stopped, and less than 2 weeks later, locals began receiving letters from the mysterious shadow. The police developed a theory. The talkative burglar had simply changed his persona to the shadow. It was figured in pulling scams, such as stealing from people and then charging the rightful owners to buy their possessions back, the talkative burglar discovered how easy it was to con people out of their money, if nothing more than for them to keep their peace of mind. So he gave up the risky and cumbersome racket of robbing homes and became the more distant and secretive shadow. In this effort, he upped the types of victims he targeted as well. But this theory was not without flaws. First off, The talkative burglar did not have an accent. Did he fake a German accent as the shadow? It is also interesting that the talkative burglar apparently had an accomplice in the form of a courier. Did the shadow have such an accomplice? Why would he even need one? Was the talkative burglar actually this courier? In one newspaper, it did state that Roscoe Nelson was confused because he thought the courier was the burglar, and yet the burglar claimed to be a different person. It was a conflicting situation, but it was the police's strongest angle. But as long as the shadow was on the loose, the police still faced embarrassment. And when letters from the shadow suddenly dried up, local law enforcement was quick to save face, suggesting he'd been scared away. They even, naively, suggested he was dead. And then, on January 20th, suddenly a new suspect. While still working with the theory that the talkative burglar and the shadow were one and the same, they turned their focus to a man named George Billings, alias Joe Brady. You'll see him listed as Brady in a lot of these old newspaper articles. Billings was an interesting fellow. He signed up with the Navy the day America joined World War I, also serving in the Army. While there, he was known as the Singing Gob because of his phenomenal singing voice. He had a criminal record and served time after the war, while also working as a vaudeville actor. His criminal career was extensive, including serving 4 years at San Quentin for grand larceny. His criminal career went as far back as at least 1906, when he went away for robbing telephone boxes. In 1910, he was sent up to San Quentin, and only a year after being released, he was busted in Kansas City for attempted burglary. He was certainly the kind of guy that law enforcement loved to lean on for a crime they were desperate to solve. The police, in another oddball claim, suggested Billings had become the shadow in an effort to pull off the ultimate acting performance. How this made sense, I don't know. Whatever acting he was doing, nobody was seeing it. From a more serious standpoint, Billings had been living in a rooming house at this time, the same house that Hollywood actress Una Munson lived in as a child. This house was also on the same block that Roscoe Nelson had been told to leave his $100, which is certainly interesting and stupid if Billings led the man he robbed practically to his doorstep to leave money. This is a slightly more busy part of town, but this is 12th between Washington at that intersection and then Alders, the intersection here. And the side of this little black building here, that is where the, I guess you could say it was a rooming house that Billings lived in. So this is where he would have been living. This is also the block where the money for Nelson was supposed to be dropped off. So the question is lingered, well, if Billings was the guy that was the talkative burglar and ripped him off, why, unless he's the biggest idiot in the world, would he pick the same block that he lived on as a place to collect the money? Like, he could be tied directly to not just this area, but this block, because his house was located right here. But Billings was also a frequent drinker, and took many drugs, according to the house proprietor, who wanted only respectable people there, and thus kicked Billings out in mid-December. To further complicate issues, it was reported that Roscoe Nelson identified a picture of Billings as the man who robbed him. But then there were reports that he identified Billings only as the courier who accepted his $35. And there's unsubstantiated claims that he thought the courier was the burglar. More confusion. Nelson also noted at this time that he saw the man on 12th Avenue when he left the $100, and yet he seemed to willingly accept that the guy still didn't get his money. Whatever the case, even if Nelson could identify Billings as the man who robbed him, that's all he could do. The idea that this burglar was also the Shadow was still just a working theory. However, Nelson also mentioned that when he had a phone call with the burglar, trying to establish the money for the diamond exchange, the burglar gave 2 names, almost as character witnesses for him. These 2 names were Bob O'Neill and Dr. Ben Norden. George Billings just happened to know both of these men. O'Neill ran the local Globe Theater, and Billings had visited him in the past to try and schedule an act of his. The day after Nelson had left his $100, Bob O'Neill was visited by Billings, and he noticed that Billings had a large roll of $5 bills on him, and the money Nelson had left had been in $5 denominations. And Dr. Norden had been a member of a court-martial against Billings, leading to his dishonorable discharge from the Navy. Nelson also said that, in their phone call, the burglar said he robbed him to provide for his wife and kids. George Billings had a wife and 2 kids. In fact, Nelson's wife, while in the city, claimed that she saw a woman and 2 children walking in a department store, and that the woman wore a ring like the one taken from the Nelson home. This is all interesting circumstantial evidence, but at the same time, many who knew Billings said they did not believe he was the burglar or the Shadow, as he did not have the cunning to pull such a thing off, which makes sense if he was just drunk all the time. With the search on for this strange vaudevillian, Billings was arrested in Seattle on January 24th. After being kicked out of the rooming house in Portland on 12th Avenue, he briefly relocated to a residence on 1st Avenue between Clay and Columbia Streets. And from there, he stayed a few nights at the Abbott Hotel on 2nd and Washington before leaving town and heading to Seattle. The police were quick to proclaim that they'd found their man, despite Billings protesting his innocence while willingly returning to Portland to try and clear his name. And, salty, dramatic drunk he seemed to be, he panned the police for not catching this guy and nabbing him as a scapegoat. His alibi was that he'd been in Seattle since December 24th, 1920, more than 2 weeks before the failed police efforts to get him. And if the German man who opened fire on police was, in fact, the Shadow, then Billings could not have been him, if his alibi were credible. To his defense, he said he'd registered in December at a hotel in Seattle, where he'd stayed for 2 weeks. He also stated he'd been detained twice as a person of interest in crimes that happened there, these detentions occurring on December 29th, 1920, and January 7th, 1921. None of this proved he couldn't have been the talking burglar, however. Roscoe Nelson had identified him as the man he met to pay for the return of his diamond. Another burglar victim, C.O. Pick, also identified Billings as the man who robbed his home. And furthermore, an Abby Lyman, who lived on Burnside Street, just east of the Willamette River, claimed Billings had robbed her home on Christmas morning 1920. Billings denied being the talkative burglar, but did implicate himself as the courier. In custody, after being told Nelson had ID'd him, Billings stated that he had worked at the Municipal Auditorium down on 3rd and Clay, near where Nelson met with the courier. While he was in the area for work, a man approached him to go make contact with Nelson. Without knowing the circumstances, Billings agreed to this. However, Nelson said this encounter happened on December 19th, and a check on Billings' work records showed he did work at the auditorium, but for only one day, December 13th. Thus, he lied about working that day, which was the reason he gave for why he was in the area at all. Was he more involved in relation to the talkative burglar than he let on? Possibly. But still, in regards to the shadow, none of this meant much. In fact, while George Billings was locked away in police custody, letters from the shadow began popping up again. This is no surprise. The shadow probably didn't like this Billings guy stealing some of his thunder. This quickly killed any hopes that Billings was their man, or at least the one they really wanted. He was still indicted in relation to the robbery of Roscoe Nelson's home. And while I found no statement that they did this, I can only assume the police checked Billings' prints against the print found on the shadow's thermos. And, of course, with the shadow resurfacing, the police sprawled out, hoping to capture him, again, unsuccessfully. There were even reports of hoax letters written by a Shadow Number 2. With creativity not being his strong suit, I can only assume this individual came about once Billings was in custody, meaning he wouldn't be confused for being the actual Shadow. Right after the Shadow began writing again, a man named Sam Seals was grabbed off the street and briefly considered as a suspect. Very briefly. Seals was found wandering the streets as if in a trance, attracting the attention of police. When they spoke to him, he said he was there to collect money from Ben Selling, one of the Shadow's target victims. When the next obvious question was asked, Seal replied, "Sure, I'm the Shadow." In reality, Seals was just a mentally ill citizen walking the streets, and after this encounter, he would be sent away to the state hospital in Salem. Things went quiet for a while. People started to forget about the Shadow, but Lord knows the police still wanted him, if nothing more than to make a positive twist against their recent embarrassment. In mid-March 1921, a man named Herbert L. Johnstone was arrested in Los Angeles after evading law enforcement from Olympia, Washington, in relation to a blackmail scheme of his. Shortly after arriving in Olympia, he sent a letter to a prominent local merchant threatening death by bomb threat if he did not send Johnstone $10,000. One can see why Portland authorities saw this man as a person of interest in the Shadow case. They quickly obtained a copy of Johnstone's letter to compare against the Shadow ones, and found they'd been penned in the same style, but later would only say that there were faint similarities between the two. Now, this did not necessarily dismiss Johnstone as the Shadow, considering the fact that he did change the style and even handwriting type with each letter he wrote. Johnstone willingly admitted to his crime in Olympia, accepting his fate and the likelihood that he would go to prison. He was something of an amateur inventor who'd been working on a project for years and needed more money to finish it. He also said that his mother was mentally ill, and he wanted extra money to help put her into a private sanitarium. He also may have been a cocaine addict. He vehemently denied being the Shadow, while admitting he got the idea to send his letter from the Shadow. When he was brought to Portland for questioning, he wouldn't even address questions related to the Shadow case. And this was after he was grilled for hours without a lawyer present. In fact, When the lawyer retained for Johnstone came to police headquarters, the police told him Johnstone hadn't arrived yet. This was untrue, but bought police more time to illegally grill a suspect without his lawyer present. Local law enforcement was getting very desperate to get their man. However, a check on Johnstone's whereabouts in previous months did reveal that he had arrived in Portland in late December 1920 and stayed there into early February 1921, putting him in the city during the early activities of the Shadow. According to this check, Johnstone registered at the Empress Hotel on January 10th, right after the first Shadow letters went out. So he was in the right place at the right time. It also came out that during his rendezvous effort in Olympia, Johnstone, like the Shadow, used a light as a signal. This was certainly of interest, but it by no means proved him to be the Shadow. At the same time, Johnstone's appearance did not match with the Shadow, or at least the man who opened fire on police that January night. He also had a voice that could never be confused for a German accent. He too would have his prints checked against that thermos print, with no luck. Some newspapers would report, erroneously, that his prints were a match, but we know they weren't, because right when local police were clamoring for some good press, a revelation was made about that thermos. Turns out, that print, which had been checked against multiple suspects, was not from the Shadow. On March 22nd, it was revealed that the print belonged to the Chief of Police, Leon Jenkins. It appears he picked this thermos up and carried it with his bare hands back to headquarters, and only then was it checked for prints. This whole time, the only solid piece of evidence that could be checked against suspects wasn't even valid. Yeah, Leon Jenkins, he was a story unto himself. Johnstone would be moved on to Olympia to face justice for the crime he had taken credit for, and he just faded away as a shadow suspect. On April 12th, he pled guilty for his Olympia crime, and around this same time, George Billings would go on trial for his charges and would be found not guilty, likely due to a lack of evidence. All they really had was Roscoe Nelson's identification, and, like Johnstone, he was also denied having a lawyer present during his interrogation. It's believed this had an effect on the jury, who took sympathy on him, so even the talkative burglar was another case left unsolved. Like a true performer, when Billings was released, he wrote out a monologue to perform and got a venue at an Oregon City picture house to tell his story of accusations as the grand, mysterious Shadow. Even though in the end he was more targeted as a talkative burglar, but show business is show business. However, only 3 days before his show was scheduled, he and a friend would be arrested on drunken charges. Remember, this was during Prohibition. He received a 12-and-a-half-day sentence, and instead of putting on a good show, he gained the reputation of being such a deadbeat drunk that he screwed himself out of the performance of a lifetime, or at least his lifetime. By the time he was released on this drunken charge, he said Portland was no good for him anymore, and that he was going to move elsewhere. Wherever he ended up is anyone's guess. By this time, still in April 1921, there was also reason to believe that the Shadow may have moved elsewhere. I personally think it was a copycat, but in April, residents in La Grande in eastern Oregon started receiving letters from a man calling himself Mr. Shadow, threatening their lives if they did not pay up. Just like in Portland, a sting was set up when a spot to leave money was established. Money was placed at that location, but nobody showed to pick it up. These activities left the small community of La Grande in fear, with police scrutinizing any unfamiliar faces in town, because certainly nobody in their tight-knit community could have been responsible. It's unknown for certain exactly where the shadow was. There were multiple instances of people trying to gain money via written correspondence and under the threat of violence or death, most of which were, again, probably copycats. One instance occurred in June of 1921, when a farmer living on Deer Island, about 35 miles north of Portland, started receiving letters demanding money or they would burn the farmer's house and barn down. Instead of calling the police, the farmer took matters into his own hands by putting green paper that looked like money where he was told to place it. He then laid in wait with some of his farm hands for this blackmailer, who turned out to be a 14-year-old boy, or at least it might have been. When the farm personnel rushed the boy, he denied being a blackmailer and said he just stumbled onto the spot and grabbed what he thought was some free cash. A new letter sent to the farmer the following day seemed to validate the boy's story. 2 months later, a highwayman named Jesse Isard, alias George Decker, was gunned down in a police decoy operation trying to bust car thieves. A German Luger was found in his possession when he died, immediately leading to the theories that he had been the shadow all along, and maybe the talkative burglar for that matter. Roscoe Nelson was brought in, and he identified him as the burglar, even though he'd shakily identified George Billings as the burglar in the past. Nelson was quoted to say, "No use hesitating. That's the man. That's the talkative burglar. I would recognize him in a million." C.O. Pick also made a partial identification of Isard as the talkative burglar. Once again, the question was being posed. Were the talkative burglar and the shadow the same person? Well, like George Billings, we have another suspect who may have been one, but likely not the other. Isard's Luger was checked and found to have a firing pin that struck its shells dead center. The shells recovered from the man who opened fire on the police, and presumed to be the shadow, showed the Luger he used had a firing pin that left an off-centered, rougher mark on the shells. Could he have had another Luger? Or, as police considered, had the shadow, Isard, recently replaced the firing pin in his gun? It's impossible to say. And again, it's possible the man who opened fire on police wasn't even the shadow in the first place. The accomplice with Isard when he died, Harry Bellington, alias Harry Brown, could have cleared up Isard's past to a degree, but said he'd only known Isard a couple days. Probably not true, but that's all he had to say. Isard did have an extensive criminal record, serving multiple different stints in prison, and he'd been in Portland when the shadow engaged in their activities. But he was also the kind of thug that did his own dirty work, criminalizing people to their faces, as opposed to hiding behind a dark alias and waiting in the woods to take extortion money. He's probably not the guilty party, but with these discoveries made after he died, it's hard to find out more, since the dead tell no tales. Months passed, and police were no closer to a resolution to this case than when they first learned of it. It's almost a surprise they didn't just say, "Hell, Jesse Isard did it. Case closed." They probably could have gotten away with that, especially way back in 1921. Granted, even months after he was gunned down, some newspapers still referenced Isard as likely being the shadow. But newspapers say all sorts of things, and I found nothing after this to prove Isard's guilt in this case. By this point, wherein no future suspects would be apprehended in the case, it's important to remember that all we know for sure about the shadow was that he spoke with a German accent and carried a German Luger. But such only applies if the man who opened fire on 2 police officers back in mid-January was the shadow. Again, police only stumbled onto this figure a couple hours after a botched effort to apprehend the shadow. I can't fully speak for his intellect, but why in the hell would the actual shadow be loitering in the area the police were tearing apart looking for him hours after his escape? It's a death wish, and we have no genuine proof that the shadow was a violent person, to the point that he never carried out his threats against his intended victims. And yet here, out of nowhere, he ambushes 2 police officers and frantically opens fire before they even knew he was there. That doesn't sound like the shadow. That sounds like a random idiot criminal stumbling onto the wrong place at the wrong time. So we must at this point question whether, to this day, we actually know anything about the shadow's make and appearance. And with that, he could have blended in easily with the general public in Portland or in any other place. The desperation got so strong that the search for the shadow stretched all the way to Japan. Reportedly, there were several people living in Yokohama who were receiving threatening letters from an unknown individual demanding large sums of money. Some locals honestly pondered if the shadow had gone international. That's how desperate things had got. But, like most unresolved cases, especially ones where nobody was actually harmed, they're easy to forget. And for a time, decades before things like social media could keep us up to date on everything everyone is doing on the hour, something like the shadow was destined to fade away. I've never seen it referenced by anyone. Even a general Google search revealed nothing outside of old newspaper articles, which I primarily used to tell this story. It's a truly forgotten event, and as far as I can gather, it was never resolved. After 1922, I found no further information on the investigation or other possible suspects. Absolutely nothing. It makes me wonder even more if it was, more or less, just presumed that Jesse Isard was the guilty party. All in all, if the identity of the shadow was determined, the media apparently did not care enough at this point to report on it. And after enough time had passed, aside from a credible confession, it would be hard to catch the shadow. All they really had were the handwriting from their letters, wherein they changed their handwriting each time. That's all they had. The shadow's actual identity was never established. Police had no idea where this person lived, where they worked, who they associated with, and so on. So for how big of a story this was when it happened, there really were only 2 suspects, and I personally don't really think either one of them were that solid. George Billings and Herbert Johnstone. Really, the strongest piece of evidence against either one of them, at least reliable evidence, was that they were in the city when these events happened, which doesn't really account for much. And Herbert Johnstone's argument that he was merely inspired by the shadow actually could make sense, especially if he was living in Portland at the time that this was happening. A lot of the articles I found that I show in this video were probably out of newspapers that Johnstone was reading while he was in the city. So it makes sense that he might try the same thing, all the way down to using a torch to get attention and trying to lure the person he wanted to pay up to a certain location. And of course, it didn't work. The one part that Johnstone seemed to forget was that the 2 times that somebody agreed to pay the shadow, the police showed up. But I don't know, maybe he thought he was smarter than the shadow and he had a better chance. The fact of the matter is, the guy willingly admitted to his crime that he committed in Olympia the moment he was arrested. And he never even came close to dropping a hint that he may have also been the shadow. Now, maybe he thought he would get into more trouble for being the shadow because the shadow threatened many more lives. But still, he was completely unshaken. And like George Billings, there was no way for them to really put him in any position where you could say like, oh yeah, he was there, absolutely he was the shadow. And the biggest struggle of all is we know so little about the shadow. And then in the case of George Billings, yeah, sure he was here, sure he had a criminal record, but the closest thing to tie him to the crime was Roscoe Nelson's vacillating perspective on his involvement as the talkative burglar. So sure, Billings was kind of a deadbeat, and he was kind of a drunk, to the point that he screwed himself out of a one-man show. But again, there's not really any proof that he was the individual in question. There's just little circumstantial pieces. And even when all is said and done, they didn't even find Billings guilty as being the talkative burglar. So that shows you where they stood on that. They could have easily just made him take the fall for that particular crime, and at least they could have had the talkative burglar taken care of, whether or not he was the shadow. And Jesse Isard, he was the last really good suspect, so people kind of just inferred he was the guy. I don't think he was the talkative burglar. He pulled no punches. This was not a guy that was going to passively send letters out to people and hope they cooperated with him. If he wanted money that bad, he would have robbed a bank or robbed a particular establishment of some kind. What we know about Isard does not correlate at all with the shadow. And what we take away from the shadow is the fact that this guy did not seem to actually be a violent individual, at least to the point that he never, as we can tell, he never actually tried carrying out his threats. Again, with how little we actually know about the shadow could have left town shortly after, or he could have just stayed and blended into Portland, knowing that nobody knew he was the guy and they just never found him. What I think happened with the shadow was, I think, regardless of what his past was, whether he was a talkative burglar or not, I think he came up with this idea and he thought, okay, I'm going to manipulate these people out of their money by making this vague threat against them based on a general understanding that people had about how advancements had been made in fighting in battle during World War I. And he can make a very vague threat that people wouldn't really know whether it was valid or not. And he can make a threat that made it so that these individuals would not be safe under any circumstances, because obviously these people could have just surrounded themselves with security and felt safe and ignored the letters, which would end things for the shadow. So of course he would make that extra threat against them so that even if they had protection, they might feel incentivized to still pay to save their lives from whatever was coming their way. And I think after the 2 failed efforts, both times the police show up instead of the intended victim, I think the shadow realized at that point that this was not going to go anywhere, that none of these people were going to pay up, no matter how many times he threatened him. And again, I think the threats he made were entirely made up. So it wasn't like he had something to actually fall back on to where he could attack one victim and escape, and then, send a new letter to all the other possible victims and be like, see, I told you this would happen. I don't think he had the capabilities to do that at all. And therefore, I think after his 2 encounters with police, he realized this was not going to be effective and it wasn't going to work. And there were reportedly letters that he sent later on. That could have been from the shadow trying to keep attention on himself when a lot of his attention was being thrown on Billings instead. They also could have been copycat letters. Again, this guy changed his handwriting with great frequency, and there were instances of people doing similar things. You can argue Herbert Johnstone was a copycat. This farmer that was targeted north of Portland in the Deer Island area, he was probably targeted by a copycat. So there could have been people sending copycat letters left and right. So I don't know if for certain these later shadow letters are genuine shadow letters or whether they were just copycat ones. They did come at a convenient time. But either way, after those 2 failed rendezvous with police, we don't really hear a lot from the shadow after that. And you just kind of see what the police were trying to do, trying to figure out who was responsible. So I think the shadow either gave it up, realized it wasn't going to work and it wasn't worth the risk at that point, and he just stopped or transitioned into some new criminal objective that we've never been able to tie to the shadow. And it's possible he could have felt the heat a little bit too much from law enforcement, and he could have possibly just split town and left. And maybe that's why you heard about people receiving letters in LeGrand, which, again, I think that was also a copycat. And then all the way to Japan. There were reports in Japan that they thought the shadow might still be active, which I think is hilarious. Very unlikely. Who knows? Maybe that person heard about the shadow story and way over in Japan decided to try the same thing to see what would happen. But either way, I think the shadow either left town and found something else to do with his time, or he just blended in with the population. Nobody knew who he was. He had a German accent. Sure, there was a lot of people way back in the day that had German accents in the Portland area. And he could have just blended back in with the populace. We have no idea.
Finally, by the end of 1922, perhaps another reason the case faded away was due to the fact that the public wasn't really mad about it or scared of it anymore. It was all fun and games at that point. And the last reference to the shadow I was able to find in print, there was reference to a show in town called A Night in Paris. As a promotion for the show, it was noted that a Shadow Jr. would be in the audience at the show, and whoever was able to identify him would be rewarded with $100. I still don't know why, but this was just one effort to promote this show, as locals were hoping it would become such a spectacle that the likes of Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, or Harold Lloyd would actually be in attendance. Even the city's mayor, George Baker, who'd been thoroughly embarrassed by the inability to capture the real shadow, promoted the show. Granted, he was a theater man before becoming mayor. It seemed the objective was to find this Shadow Jr., who'd been engaging in all kinds of crooked hijinks around town, at the show itself, which did not happen. So the search expanded to anywhere in the city after that. And however this was even supposed to happen, a Ben Bowman encountered an American Legion man named Edward Valentine at Southwest Broadway in Washington and identified him accurately as Shadow Jr. Again, I don't know how this worked. He just saw a random guy on the street and said, "What the hell? I bet he's that shadow guy." But he identified the right person. Or maybe that's how Bowman knew. And that was it. Almost like one of the suspects in the case, George Billings, the shadow went from a dark story on page 1, leaving many of Portland's prominent citizens in fear for their lives, to a theatrical joke. The fear had vanished. The shadow was a legend at this point, a fun little story to pass on to future generations. People could laugh about him now. It wasn't a crime anymore. The locals were ready to let it go, and thus, as far as I can presume, the police finally let it go as well. And the shadow vanished, just as mysteriously as he had arrived.